my presentation will be totally different from the former one. Firstly, I am not an anthropologist. I am not the historian of religion, but I am an art historian. And what's more, I am engaged in this subject for 1 year now, so it's very short. So this presentation is basically about my ongoing research project on the entanglements of artistic modernism, socialist modernity, and alternative spirituality in the former socialist countries, and precisely in the former GDR. And although the art history, and more recently the art history of the GDR, belongs to the best research phenomena of German contemporary history, this subject essentially remains a blank spot in German art historiography. Its recognition is all the more difficult due to the lack of in-depth religious or social historical studies that could provide contextual frames for further research into spirituality-imbued art in the GDR of this period. Spirituality in the GDR has only been studied in terms of traditional religions, the CED church policy, or the situation of Christians, with the main focus placed on the relationship between the Stasi and the church, a rather simple top-down relationship which says little to nothing about lived religion, let alone alternative spirituality. German language publications post-1989 commonly asserted that the centrally imposed forced secularization of East German society, achieved through both discursive and institutional measures, extended equally into public and private spheres, resulted in an inner secularization of citizens. Thilo Gutze-Regenbogen, an authority in Buddhism in the GDR and a long-standing researcher on Carlfriedrich Claus, artist who will be the subject of further discussion, criticized the authors of those post-1989 publications for perpetuating the wishful thinking of the Communist Party. He also underscores the paucity of sources. Due to the underground nature of activities, the artists interested in alternative spirituality, the most valuable source of information remains private archives, word of mouth, or so-called Erfahrungsgeschichte, so recollections of the practitioners and theorists themselves. The largest and most recognized group among East German artists engaged with alternative forms of spirituality were the anthroposophists, whose activities took place under the banner of the Christengemeinschaft, Bewegung für die religiöse Erneuerung. They continued the interwar traditions thanks to figures like Werner Löffler, organizing painting workshops, seminars, and lectures, in which, importantly, they also smuggled in knowledge about modernist Western art that was difficult to access in the GDR. In most cases, however, artists anthroposophists limited themselves to Steiner's own theory of color and repertoire of motifs. Exceptions include, as we see here, Winifred Zielonka, Hans Preusse, and Albert Henning. While artists directly connected to Christengemeinschaft formed a somewhat identifiable group, the remaining artists were individual figures, often working on the periphery of the art world or living in inner emigration. A notable example is Rudolf Weber, who translated Wilhelm Ostwald's color theory, Hans Kaiser's esoteric theories of harmony, along with Mazdazan and Johannes Ludwig Schmick's breathing exercises, into his Bauhaus-rooted geometric abstractions and later proto-conceptual sound experiments. Against this background, Carlfriedrich Claus, whose artistic practice I would like to present as a separate case study, is particularly noteworthy for several reasons. First and foremost, a significant amount of source material about him has been preserved. Most of his ink and graphic works, the artist's library, his notes and letters. Moreover, Claus belonged to a group of East German artists who defied simplistic classification as either dissidents or conformists. Although he did little to nothing to toe the party line as an artist and earned the label of heretic among the GDR officials, he dedicated his entire life to studying Marxist authors and maintained faith in the attainability of socialist utopia. From the very beginning of his artistic experiments, he sought avenues for art to contribute to future communist realism. It was a quote from Claus. Both the form and the complexity of philosophical, literary, and political allusions found in Claus' work pose a significant challenge to their immediate understanding. It is impractical to catalogue all the artist's intellectual influences. However, for the purpose of this paper, it's worth noting that Claus started studying Chinese, Armenian, Russian, and Hebrew by himself from a young age. At the tender age of 10, his readings included Karl Marx and Isaac Luria. And a few years later, Rudolf Steiner, Spinoza, Novalis, Paracelsus, and finally Jacob Böhme. From the 1950s onwards, Claus delved into various subjects, such as further studies in Jewish mysticism, the arcana of shamanism, Tibetan and Buddhism, the practice of dream yoga, and tantric art. Claus was also notably influenced by his penfriend Ernst Bloch. The study of esoteric writing stimulated both the intellectual development and creativity of Claus. It was within this text that he encountered, and here quote, anticipations, shining seeds of the future, the end of quote, that would underpin his artistic practice. Moreover, Claus believed that certain strands of esotericism are integral to the evolution of materialist philosophy through their influence on the transformation of consciousness. He shared his opinions in a 1978 letter to Gerd Hensch. I believe that the critical experimental application of methods developed by mysticism in social contexts entirely different from our own could prove instrumental for us here and now in our GDR. This is because such methods may contribute to the reinforcement and intensification of old-party consciousness, which manifests as a processual element of overarching social and natural processes. Hensch, with whom Claus corresponded in the mid-70s, was a Marxist author who published several texts about Jacob Böhme in the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie. While Claus can be called spiritual seeker rather than believer, and therefore Böhme is just one among numerous authors referenced by him, Böhme will serve further as a kind of pars pro toto, illustrating how esoteric mystic traditions were a driving force behind Claus' innovative and radical intermedial practices. In these practices, as Sarah James notes, quote, performative, conceptual, activist, aesthetic, and material words converge, along with his ideological reflections. And needless to say, esotericism and mysticism, labeled as superstition and irrationalism, was denounced by the authorities of the German Democratic Republic. Still, it lay at the very core of historical materialism. Therefore, Claus, quote, built upon a lineage of spiritual comrades, including the theologian of revolution, Thomas Müntzer, and his contemporary, the romantic Marxist Ernst Bloch. According to Marx, mystics such as the, quote, divinely inspired Jacob Böhme, the end of quote, exposed the fallibility of church doctrines and challenged its institutional hegemony. Böhme has also inspired Bloch in his formulation of real dialectic, a Marxist dialectical concept upheld by Claus. Bloch envisioned real dialectic as a principle governing the motion of every material being, sustaining them in a state of continuous productive tension. This principle, integrated into Marxist historiography, forms the bedrock of Bloch optimism regarding humanity's capacity to transform the material world towards a future communist utopia. For Claus, it was language and sound which preceded the image as fundamental and primary vehicles for conveying ideas. By the half of the 1950s, he started his, quote, attempts at speaking also externally in relation to processes occurring in nature, end of quote. These undertakings, in turn, marked the conception of Lautprozesse and Sprachexerzitien, the recording of asemantic, multi-layered sound communications of magnetic tape. These experiments were later committed to paper, which Claus termed Sprachblätter, roughly translated as spoken sheets, speaking sheets, or talking papers. In a letter to Ilse Garnier, dated September 6, 1967, Claus expounds upon Lautprozesse, highlighting the pursuit of a new cosmic existential speech, capable of conveying the micro and microcosm, their figures of existence, life and death, their unknown mystery hovering in the air, the end of quote. His experiments were thus intended to probe the deepest layers of language, those veiling the mysterium of being and enabling transgeneric cosmic communication. He continues, language here is a magical substance, a contact material extending to stone, fire, stars, and water, the end of quote. Claus found the study of linguistic science conducive to this quest for the most epistemically efficient and consequently disalienating mode of communication. He discerned in them, quote, a certain charm that there must be something more there, beyond and outside linguistic communicative transmission, something not entirely comprehensible, end of quote. Claus' words express the quintessential desire of esoteric hermeneutics to uncover the mystical dimension of language or text, unveiling obscure meanings to the reader and transcending the overt transmission. In the early 60s, Claus shifted towards intricate compositions in black ink marked by vibrating palimpsestic qualities consisting of tangled, quivering lines and words resembling a cluster of amorphous life forms. According to Claus, these, quote, complex organic flowing structures were signs of matter shaping the emerging speech, end of quote. Those hermetic theories that particularly captivated Claus invested language with the capacity for word creation. Hence, the conviction that reclaiming this primordial instrument of creation could prove to be an invaluable tool for word transformation. References to the concepts of speaking matter, the organic nature of speech, and an analogy or even homology between language and nature are evident in Claus' Vibrationstexte, dating from 1959-1960, such as Lichensatz. The black ink drawing, Organische Vibration, appears to illustrate the desire to represent the inner pulsation of matter and the primordial language, which manifests itself through the ceaseless pulsation of the world, pointing at the acoustic properties of every single thing and being. For Claus, non-verbal communication and consequently the body served as a significant means of experiencing the world, a source of knowledge and a tool of artistic expression. Alongside the eye, a motif recurrent in his oeuvre, Claus frequently depicted hands in his prints. Very close to his heart, the Lurianic tradition viewed hands as a corporeal knowledge organizers. As such, they became symbols of embodied understanding and furthering of inner knowledge. Claus described his Sprachstrukturen as inkarniert, so incarnated, and cellular, in other words, anchored in the body and its processes. These ideas can be found in his numerous statements, such as that from 1964. Quote, I try to penetrate the sentence with all my limbs. I immerse myself in it. I am moved by it down to the smallest and thickest ends and beginnings fibers of my body, to its core. I am stimulated to it, to the bone. End of quote. Direct references to articulatory thinking, or as Claus would put it, words leading through, quote, cortex, hands, throat, heart, throat, legs, phallus, the end of quote, can also be found, for example, in chapter 18 of Böhme's Aurora, where the theosophist attributes religious significance to the characteristics and energies of individual sounds. Aurora is also the title of Claus' series of prints, which represent a unique synthesis of his insights into the interplay between society and the individual, humanity and nature, woman and man, body and spirit, and theory and practice. The title simultaneously alludes to the October Revolution and Böhme's seminal book from 1612, Aurora or Morning Grow Ascending. Biblical verses evoking dawn have, of course, conventionally been construed as divine promises of a glorious future. Nevertheless, for the communist Claus, this personal and collective rebirth was to transpire not primarily through faith, but via post-revolutionary socio-political order. The title aside, Böhme's influence is also hinted at by the annotation of the work, The Processual Realization of New Relationships Between Women and Men Free, which juxtaposes quotes from Böhme and Lenin. The former is alluded to in a passage discussing the matter from which paradise is built, taken from the treatise De Tribus Principis. Claus was particularly preoccupied with the consciousness of matter. And here's the quote. Some time ago, I heard a discussion by a Soviet philosopher on a Moscow radio. He addressed the hypothesis that all material structural operations, even those inorganic, either trigger consciousness or are accompanied by consciousness. Therefore, one could establish a link to Paracelsus and his mystically imbued understanding of nature and also Böhme's. The end of quote. The subsequent work in a series titled Zwischen Makro- und Mikrokosmischen in a style of Paracelsus is shrouded in parchment paper adorned with a quote from Marx and Engels. In their discussion of materialistic philosophers, they referred to Böhme, quote, among the qualities inherent in matter, motion is the most and foremost, not solely in the form of mechanical and mathematical motion, but chiefly in the form of an impulse, a vital spirit, attention. The end of quote. Claus' Aurora was conceived as a tool in the Ringen Erkenntnis, so struggle for knowledge, yet the desire for knowledge must be followed by a desire for change, aided by active perception. In a brief introduction, Claus elucidates, quote, the present work is intended as a contribution to the experiments of change offered to us. The work does not wish to be viewed disinterestedly, but rather examined, tested, and utilized. As demonstrated by the examples above, Claus suggested that not only images, but also language, sound, and the body actively contribute to the production of knowledge, which translates into action. The body matters not only throughout the creation of Sprachblätter, it also plays a role in the process of their reception. In 1993, Claus revisited Aurora as he transformed it into a spatial installation called Experimental Schriftraum Aurora. He also offered new ways of interaction with the work. Annette Gilbert argues that this Verräumlichung, so spatialization, is a fundamental concept to Claus' oeuvre. Researchers agree that Böhme stands apart from other thinkers with his distinct writing style, which creates the message and is of equal importance as the content itself. Joshua Levi Ian Ganska described the mystic style as image-laden and performative, one that engages the reader's imagination, body, senses, and spatial awareness. Ganska further elaborates this Böhme's text, quote, dramatically combine, fuse, and orchestrate spatial, corporeal, and visual motifs, the end of quote, terming this structure, quote, corporeal practice of envisioning or a practice of corporeal envisioning. Similarly, a close correlation between vision and corporeality exists in Claus' Aurora, which was inspired by Böhme to fuse Marxist science with sensual passion. It is precisely this corporeal practice of envisioning that spins a web of references into motion, consequently forging intricate semantic relationships in the embodied imagination of the viewer. However, before unraveling the artist's complex ideological program, one must confront a fundamental difficulty highlighted by almost all authors grappling with Claus' work, its almost complete or partial unintelligibility. Claus' visual and textual strategy could be called rhetorics of secrecy, which constantly oscillates between between earnest attempts to convey profound philosophical meaning and a blend of hermeticism and unintelligibility. Claus, in which he also resembles Böhme, regarded writing as a mode of thinking and transforming knowledge, and one actively involved in the cognitive process. What then did perceive as communist realism, which he sought to embody through his heart, while the communist content of the substantial portion of his work is relatively discernible, their form is quintessentially a departure from realism. Claus' conception of realism may become more comprehensible when construed as an outgrowth of his fascination with the Paracelsian notion of creative imagination as a cosmic force of creation. Paracelsus, followed by Böhme, meticulously distinguishes imagination from mere fancy, which spawns images within the mind that are devoid of meaning and agency. It is important to recall that Claus aspired not to be an artist creating works of art as representations as much, but rather to actively engage in the socio-political processes of Experimenten der Veränderung, experiments of change. These experiments, propelled by the force of imagination, generate imaginal products that are, by no means, in opposition to what is real. Instead, they enable its existence by being the essence of that reality. This conception of imagination aligns with Cornelius Castoriadis' definition of radical imagination derived from psychoanalysis, which incidentally was another one of Claus' areas of interest, or Marxism. He describes this as the tectonic protean substance out of which all social institutions and identities are made, and which likewise is constantly in motion under the surface of society, the end of quote. In turn, Andy Merrifield, in his project of radical magical Marxism, postulates to restore Marxism to its original transformative power of the imagination, which is crucial to the subversive poetic politics, creating a space-time of autonomous activity, of intellectual, artistic, and practical endeavor. In this light, Claus' existential and creative stance, which eludes unequivocal alignment with either power or dissent, is probably best described by the category of Eigen-Sinn, one's own sense, own meaning, created by Alf Lüdtke and Thomas Lindenberger. Drawing upon Marx, they argue that in the prevailing power dynamics of a given time and place, individuals can, quote, focus on a particular task, end of quote, which often evolves into a, quote, stubbornness that can sometimes lead to conflict, as best articulated by the German phrase sein Ding durchziehen, to do a thing of one's own, to stick to one's guns. The theory of Eigen-Sinn, quote, is primarily concerned with the authentic individual pathways of producing and discovering meaning developed through the body and the senses, the end of quote. With Claus, Eigen-Sinn was manifested in his desire towards producing and discovering meaning beyond the binary framework of for and against, and a readiness to engage, albeit on one's own terms. His inclination, as reflected in his works, also involved a refusal to accept the separation of secular, realistic, political, or cognitive, sensual, and spiritual, mystical, esoteric as discrete and conflicting categories. Claus' mystical communist realism found its focal point in socio-political reality, his works becoming, quote, a groundwork for the future atheist communist mysticism. Drawing from André Comte-Sponville, Claus could perhaps be described as a mystical atheist. His concept of the absolute was devoid of transcendent being and manifested himself through the medium of art in the earthy realm only. Thank you.
What lies far below the surface has long remained out of sight, and usually out of mind. Now, however, humanity's close ties to the ocean